Introduction. This is the second of two videos describing Galang Smangus, a successful indigenous Christian anarchist community in Taiwan. See the link in the video description box if you'd like to view the previous video. In this video, I'll be describing how Smangus operates, explaining why I characterize it as anarcho-collectivist, and comparing the results of its collectivist ecotourism industry with the outcomes of two nearby villages which operate ecotourism with a free market capitalist model. Throughout this video, I'll be making various comments for the benefit of anyone listening to the video but not watching it. This will be particularly necessary on the occasions when important visual content is displayed. Since this commentary will occasionally be lengthy, I'll always let you know when I'm doing this, so you can use the timestamps in the video description to skip to another section if you are watching the video and I'm just describing something on screen which you can already see and understand for yourself. I was quite overwhelmed by the immensely positive reception of the first video, and I'm very grateful to everyone who left a like or a comment. These were the most common questions about Smangus which were raised directly or indirectly by your comments. Why did Taiwan's indigenous people convert to Christianity? What role does Smangus traditional culture have in the community? To what extent is Smangus really anarchist? I've taken some time in this video to address these questions in detail. Consequently, this video is long. In fact, it's about 2 hours long. That's something you might want to know in advance if you're listening to this video without watching it. These topics will be covered. 1. Taiwan's indigenous people and Christianity. 2. Smangus indigenous Christianity. 3. How Smangus operates. 4. How anarchist is Smangus. 5. How successful is Smangus. 6. Internal and external challenges. 7. Conclusion. Since this video is extremely long and detailed, you may not want to watch it completely from start to finish. Use the timestamps in the video description box to navigate the content. Please note that throughout this video I will be using the term Han Chinese colonizers, a standard term used in the relevant scholarly literature. Although I recognize that not all the Chinese colonizers of Taiwan belonged to the Han ethnic group, for example, some were Manchu, the Han, including various groups of the Hoklo people, such as the Hakka, were overwhelmingly the most numerous colonizers, and throughout Taiwan's rulership by the imperialist Qing dynasty, the Han Chinese were the dominant ethnic group who imposed their culture and values on the indigenous people. As I mentioned in the previous video, the people of Smangus belong to one of the tribes of the Atayal people, called Taiyazu in Chinese and Dayan in the Atayal languages. Throughout this video, I will be using the standard English pronunciation of this word, Atayal, unless I am citing or quoting Atayal people themselves. When I speak the Atayal language itself in this video, I use the Skuliak dialect common to Hsinchu County, where Smangus is located. Throughout this video, you will occasionally hear songs performed by the Pukusan Na Taoshan, the elementary school choir of Galang Ulai, called in Chinese Qingchuan Bulo, an Atayal tribal settlement in Wufeng Township, Hsinchu County, in Taiwan. The choir is directed by Hui-wen traditional Atayal singer, musician, and educational professional, and many of the songs have been arranged to music by her husband, Ivan Bawang, a well-known Atayal composer, singer, musician, and educator. Hui-wen and Bawang have been personal friends of mine since 2013. The school choir is well known and recognized in Taiwan, having won several awards and performed twice in front of the President of Taiwan on Double 10 Day, the National Day of the Republic of China. Finally, a few comments on my use of Chinese words. When speaking Chinese, I use Taiwan Guoyu, which is strongly influenced by Minanyu, the Minnan Chinese dialect, so the pronunciation is distinctly different from China's Putonghua. In this video, I also slightly overpronounce words in Chinese for the sake of clarity and the benefit of people with reduced hearing. Additionally, when citing Chinese authors, I use the naming convention with which they have signed their papers. Some of them use the traditional convention of placing their family name first, while others use the modern convention of placing their family name last. I follow whichever convention each individual has used. Taiwan's indigenous people and Christianity. This section is going to be long, so I'll provide a broad overview first. If you'd rather hear about Smangus itself, use the timestamps in the video description to navigate to another section. Given Christianity's appalling historical record with indigenous people, you will probably guess that Taiwan's indigenous people were forced into conversion to Christianity by colonizers and their predatory missionaries who left a trail of cultural destruction in their wake. Some commentary in the relevant scholarly literature certainly gives this impression. William Hipwell, Professor of Geography and Environmental Studies at Carleton University in Canada, writes, quote, "Christianity arrived in Taiwan with Dutch colonizers, and there was a deliberate attempt by missionaries to destroy traditional religion." End quote. However, the real answer is far more complex, not least because Christianity arrived in Taiwan in 3 distinct stages at different times and interacted with the indigenous population in different ways. As mentioned in the previous video, Christianity was introduced to Taiwan by the Dutch in the 17th century, then repressed by the Chinese colonizers who defeated the Dutch, was revived in Taiwan by Protestant missionaries in the 19th century, then repressed by the Japanese colonizers who defeated the Chinese, then revived again in Taiwan by Chinese missionaries in the mid-20th century after the Japanese lost control of Taiwan and the army of the Chinese Republic of China invaded, with around 2 million Han Chinese colonizers. Each of these waves of missionaries had an impact on Taiwan's indigenous people, but the lasting effects of Christianity in Taiwan were very different each time. For example, though Hipwell speaks of Dutch missionaries attempting to, quote, destroy traditional religion, end quote, in actual fact, the Dutch had virtually no impact on the religion of Taiwan's indigenous people, partly because the Dutch settlements were confined to only about a third of Taiwan, and consequently had very little access to the indigenous tribes. Curiously, the overall effect of Christianity, even via the Dutch, was positive, helping to preserve indigenous language and culture and prevent the assimilation of Taiwan's indigenous people by the imperialist Chinese and Japanese colonizers. Rick de Busse, professor of linguistics at Taiwan's National Zhengzhi University, writes, quote, "Often the influence of Christianity is interpreted in a negative light and is seen as an arrogant Western intruder and a destructive force on traditional culture," end quote, adding, quote, "examples abound," end quote, and citing the decline of Celtic Druidism, the destruction of Mayan literature, and the negative influence of various evangelical groups in the Amazon. However, he also writes, quote, "In Taiwan, and more specifically in Bunun communities, this has never really been the case," end quote. De Busse acknowledges that, quote, "Christianity largely replaced traditional religion," end quote, but still considers that, quote, "contrary to the widely held conception of Christianity as a force destructive to indigenous culture, Christianity in Taiwan has in general exerted an altogether more positive influence," end quote. Time constraints prevent this video addressing the highly complex interplay of reasons why Christianity had a largely positive effect on Taiwan's indigenous people and why it was so readily accepted by them. However, one of the fundamental drivers of indigenous conversion to Christianity was the sharp contrast between the contemptuous treatment which Taiwan's indigenous people received from the Han Chinese colonizers on the one hand, and the far more sympathetic treatment they received from Christian missionaries on the other. In his 600-page work, Statecraft and Political Economy on the Taiwan Frontier 1600 to 1800, John Shepherd, professor of anthropology at the University of Virginia, provides a highly detailed explanation of the way in which Taiwan's indigenous people responded to Christianity in different ways at different times. One common theme he describes is practicality. Indigenous people gained a wide range of advantages and benefits from their association with Christianity, even if they didn't actually convert. Shepherd's historical overview, substantiated by citations from other scholars, demonstrates that the gradual acceptance of Christianity by Taiwan's indigenous people was predominantly driven by their perception of the Han Chinese colonizers as a hostile force with unacceptable socio-cultural values, which was intent on expropriating their land and annihilating their culture through assimilation, and their perception of Christian missionaries as a sympathetic force through which they could gain socio-economic benefits which would help preserve their traditional moral values and cultural identity. Simply put, Taiwan's indigenous people adopted Christianity not by being compelled by Christian threats of force or convinced by Christian theology, but by being repelled by Han Chinese colonizers on the one hand and attracted by practical benefits on the other. In fact, their adoption of Christianity was very largely a self-preservation mechanism. Professor Xie Shizhong, an anthropologist at National Taiwan University, writes, quote, "That is, Christianity stands as a symbol of power introduced from Western civilization that indigenous peoples appropriated in order to cope with the continuous impact of Han Chinese civilization." End quote. Similarly, when writing of the adoption of Christianity by Taiwan's indigenous plains-dwelling people, referred to collectively as the Siraya, Shepherd writes, quote, "A better view of the impact of the missionaries is to see them as offering the Siraya not new values, but new routes to the achievement of traditional Sirayan values, military alliances that won unprecedented victories in war, and marriages that enabled couples to begin families earlier than ever before." End quote. Broadly speaking, motivations for the indigenous acceptance of Christianity fall into these categories. 1. Military protection from imperialist Han Chinese colonizers. 2. Recognition of shared social values with Christians. 3. Cultural protection from assimilation by Han Chinese colonizers. 4. Socio-economic benefits provided through Christianity. Overwhelmingly, Taiwan's indigenous people accepted Christianity voluntarily, motivated by extremely practical concerns for the various benefits it provided. That's the end of this summary. Now you can continue watching in order to look at these categories in detail, or use the timestamps in the video description to skip to another section. Military protection from imperialist Han Chinese colonizers. As mentioned in the previous video, the early Dutch settlers of the 17th century had virtually no success in converting Taiwan's indigenous people to Christianity. The small number of plains-dwelling tribes who did convert clearly did so because they felt the Dutch military victories against the Chinese proved the Christian god was more powerful than their own god and their shaman, called ecological. Shepherd writes that early Dutch military victories, quote, "demonstrated the power of the Dutch god and discredited the teachings of the ecological," end quote. Proof of this theological practicality appeared not long after, when the Han Chinese colonizers obtained military supremacy over the Dutch. In response, the Siraya people promptly abandoned Christianity, perceiving the Christian god as weaker than those of the Chinese. Shepherd quotes a dismayed Dutch missionary writing that the deconverted Siraya, quote, "now speak with much disdain of the true Christian faith, which we endeavored to implant in their hearts," end quote. After the Dutch were expelled from Taiwan, the Han Chinese colonizers enlarged their control over the territory and made increasing efforts to subjugate and assimilate the indigenous people. By the time European Protestant missionaries arrived in the 19th century, the Siraya people were again prepared to test the practical benefits of Christianity. Shepherd writes that at this time, the Siraya, quote, "hoped that conversion would bring European protection against oppressive Han," end quote. In 1823, a collective letter from 14 Siraya villages was sent to the Han Chinese administration in Taiwan, describing in bitter terms the historical disenfranchisement of the indigenous people by the Chinese colonizers over the last 200 years, and seeking better terms. In particular, the letter notes the seizure of indigenous land by the Han Chinese, saying, quote, Han tenants take advantage and seduce us with loans of cash. Now, nearly all the Aborigine lands have been purchased by or pledged to Han, end quote. Under such circumstances, indigenous tribes welcomed European missionaries, well aware that they were supported by strong nations overseas, and hoping their conversion to Christianity would enlist the Europeans as their military allies. Shepherd writes, quote, many Plains Aborigines converted in waves of enthusiasm, convinced that the powerful missionaries would protect them from further Han encroachment, end quote. Similarly, Dominic McDevitt Parks of the United States National Archives and Records Administration writes that, quote, a primary and even overriding motivation for the Aborigines in conversion was to increase power with respect to, or at least achieve protection from, their Chinese neighbors, end quote. This astute conclusion was proved correct. McDevitt Parks write that in 1868, quote, British gunboats responded to further attacks on missionaries by putting in troops at Anping and forcing the local officials to grant the missionaries recognition, protection under the law, and indemnities for their damages, enhancing the prestige and influence of the foreign missionaries, end quote. McDevitt Parks notes that this action also protected the local indigenous village, prompting, quote, a surge in the village's enthusiasm for the religion of the foreigners, end quote. He also records that 2 years later, members of the Catholic Dominican Order of Priests, quote, continued their defense of Aborigine well-being, buying back Aborigine land, end quote. That was land which had been expropriated by Chinese colonizers. Similarly, Dr. Huang Xuanwei of the Institute of Ethnology in Academia Sinica, Taiwan, writes that during the early 20th century, quote, not only Western missionaries showed concern for the Aborigines, but the Taiwanese churches also felt a sense of responsibility toward them, end quote. The indigenous perception of Christianity as a religion of benevolent power continued well into the late 20th century. Huang notes that after the Second World War, Taiwan's indigenous Amis tribe, quote, expected the Americans to govern Taiwan because, in their view, Japan was defeated by the United States, end quote. Huang adds that even when the Amis were surprised by the Chinese taking over Taiwan instead, the Amis still adopted, quote, Christianity, the religion of the American victors, end quote. This perception was reinforced by the establishment of American military bases in Taiwan shortly after the Second World War, providing indigenous people with a sense of security from further invasions by either China or Japan. For over 300 years, therefore, Christianity has been viewed by many of Taiwan's indigenous people as the religion of foreign but generally benevolent allies who have protected them repeatedly from the oppression of the Han Chinese and Japanese colonizers. Recognition of shared socio-cultural values with Christians. Although it may seem counterintuitive, Taiwan's indigenous people found they shared far more socio-cultural values with foreign Christians than they did with the Han Chinese colonizers. Shepherd writes that, quote, Confucian attitudes towards the proper roles of women were severe, end quote, citing strict chastity requirements and full-body clothing for women, subordination of women to a patriarchal family structure, prearranged marriages without the consent of the bride or groom, social segregation of men and women, and prohibitions against women working or traveling outside the home without company. In contrast, Shepherd notes that indigenous women were free to choose whoever they wished to court and marry, had the right to divorce their husbands, sat, quote, as an equal among the men at family meals, end quote, and participated in the decision-making processes of the extended family. Consequently, Shepherd writes, quote, the Chinese model of family organization held little attraction for Aborigine women, end quote. He also observes that the Chinese practices of female infanticide and foot-binding, quote, appalled the Aborigines and seriously undermined Chinese claims to moral superiority in Aborigine eyes, end quote. Han Chinese sexual values were also strongly at odds with indigenous culture. Shepherd notes that, quote, Han interpreters and traders sometimes provoked Aborigine revolts by coercing sexual favours from Aborigine women, end quote. This was shockingly taboo to Taiwan's indigenous people. Dr. Ralph Covell, former senior professor of world Christianity at Denver Seminary in Colorado, records that, quote, in general, sexual morality was valued highly among the original inhabitants of Taiwan, end quote, citing prohibitions against, quote, fornication and adultery, end quote, as transgressions against the ancestral spirits. A wide range of anthropological sources confirm that Taiwan's indigenous people have traditionally been strictly monogamous, with the Atayal people in particular even being described by one source as, quote, strictly monogamous and traditionally puritanical, end quote. Consequently, Taiwan's indigenous people found Christian sexual morality to be entirely in harmony with their own. Most attractive to indigenous women, conversion to Christianity did not require them to give up any of their traditional culture's rights and privileges, unlike assimilation to Han Chinese cultural values, which stripped them all away. It should be noted that there was one significant difference between the moral culture of the Siraya people and the foreign religion of Christianity. Shepherd notes that the Siraya Inibs, or shaman, quote, taught that a married woman should not complete a pregnancy until she was in her 30s, end quote, with the result that women were required to abort their pregnancies until they were approaching middle age or until their husbands turned 40 and were no longer deemed fit for war. Shepherd writes that within their congregations, Christian missionaries, quote, outlawed abortion and encouraged couples to live together and rear children jointly. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this cultural change was adopted enthusiastically by Siraya women and vanished in the 17th century after about 20 years of missionary influence. Historian Leonard Blusser notes that this change coincided with particularly severe intertribal warfare, which left the Siraya in danger of a lack of warriors, and suggests that this additional external pressure made the Siraya more willing to accept the missionaries' abortion ban, since, in purely practical terms, they needed all the able-bodied males they could produce. Again, we see indigenous concerns for practicality motivating their conversion to Christianity. Protection of indigenous culture from assimilation. Not only did Taiwan's indigenous people perceive that conversion to Christianity did not require them to sacrifice their traditional culture or identity, they were well aware that, in contrast, the Han Chinese colonizers were intent on assimilating the indigenous people and replacing their historical cultures with the Confucianism of the imperialist Qing dynasty. Under the Qing dynasty, the Han Chinese colonizers took comprehensive steps to eradicate the indigenous culture. Shepherd notes the way in which indigenous place names were replaced with Chinese names referring to Confucian values, and describes indoctrination programs intended to, quote, convince locals of the moral superiority of the Confucian order and to foster ideological orthodoxy and attitudes of submission to constituted authority, end quote. He also writes that Chinese officials were, quote, confident of the superiority of Chinese culture, end quote, and believed the indigenous people would gradually understand, quote, the self-evident superiority of Confucian morality, end quote. Shepherd also cites aims of the Qing dynasty's Taiwan prefect in 1729, which was, quote, not just that Aborigines would become civilized, law-abiding subjects, but that they would be transformed into Han, end quote. The explicit aim of the Han Chinese colonizers was to transform the indigenous people into Han Chinese, annihilating their original culture in the process. Shepherd describes education programs in which, quote, Aborigine youths were taught to revere Confucian civilization and the imperial state, end quote, reading texts which, quote, spoke of notions of social hierarchy, duty, obligation to parents, and the subordination of women, end quote. Citing Han Chinese belief in the inevitability of this process, Shepherd says, quote, traditional Chinese theory assumed that Confucianization was the result of a recognition by lesser peoples of the intrinsic superiority of Chinese culture, end quote. Strange as it may seem, it was the earliest Christian missionaries who provided Taiwan's indigenous people with important tools to resist assimilation by the Han Chinese colonizers. Driven by the desire to preach Christianity, Dutch missionaries of the early 17th century created an alphabet for various indigenous languages whose people had never had a writing system. The missionaries produced large lexicons preserving vast collections of indigenous vocabulary and grammar, and used these to teach the indigenous people, as well as to translate the Bible and other Christian literary works. The result was that many indigenous people became literate in their own language and were consequently able to record their culture in new ways. The importance of this literacy to the preservation of indigenous culture is clearly demonstrable from the fact that it was of great concern to the Han Chinese colonizers, who were intent on only teaching the indigenous people Chinese, or more correctly, Standard Northern Mandarin. Shepherd describes the Han Chinese, quote, sense of unease over the persistence of Dutch writing, end quote, the urgency with which they established schools for the teaching of Chinese, and the relief expressed by an official record in 1740, which, quote, reported the disappearance of the Dutch writing and claimed that all Aborigine accounts were being kept in Chinese, end quote. However, Chinese efforts to eradicate indigenous literacy in their own languages were not entirely successful, and a new wave of Christian missionaries in the 19th century revived and expanded the preservation of indigenous language. Consequently, de Busse notes that, quote, it could be argued that Christian organizations and the creation of a modern religious linguistic idiom have been major contributing factors to the continued survival of some of the Austronesian languages of Taiwan, end quote. De Busse also notes that Christian missionaries, quote, were careful to incorporate elements of traditional culture in their local religious practices, end quote, and to use indigenous languages in their church services. He also adds that the Christian missionaries of the 19th and 20th centuries aimed for, quote, fully indigenized churches, end quote, which allowed Christianity to be acculturated by indigenous groups. In fact, Anne Halen notes, missionary linguistic studies enabled, quote, terminological linkages between the concept of the Christian's God and the local concept of their Atayal God, end quote, which in turn, quote, helped enable the Atayal people to venerate this Christian God by keeping certain traditional customs, neither to condemn themselves nor to keep them away from their own Atayal God, end quote. This not only made it possible for indigenous people to be converted without renouncing or displacing their original culture, it also provided them with another way of preserving their culture against the assimilation efforts of the Han Chinese colonizers. Throughout the later 20th century, Christian missionaries remained the indigenous people's most reliable allies against assimilation. De Busse says, quote, Western churches were instrumental in the protection of indigenous languages, including Bunun, against the aggressive and destructive policies of cultural and linguistic unification of the Taiwanese government, end quote. De Busse describes how, during the decades of Taiwan's language unification policy, indigenous people, quote, were forced to speak Mandarin Chinese in school and in public at the threat of psychological and corporal punishment, end quote. Throughout this era, Christian churches were a refuge for indigenous language and culture, providing a sacred space for indigenous people to learn, speak, and write their own language, continue traditional practices of dance and dress, and preserve their traditional morality and core religious concepts. Christianity became fully appropriated and acculturated by Taiwan's indigenous people to the extent that it became a vehicle for the protection and perpetuation of their original culture. Consequently, to be a Christian was to be indigenous, and equally importantly, to be a Christian was to be non-Chinese. Additionally, de Busse observes, quote, churches in Taiwan have always been staunch protectors of Aboriginal rights and languages, end quote. He notes in particular the efforts of Yushan Theological College and Seminary, which, quote, played a pivotal role in the indigenous rights movement in Taiwan, end quote, by demanding recognition of all Taiwan's indigenous people, the abolition of the reservation system by which indigenous people were forced to rent their own land from the government, restoration of indigenous land rights, and greater indigenous political autonomy. Socio-economic benefits provided by Christians. Finally, in line with the highly practical approach to their interaction with foreign missionaries, Taiwan's indigenous people often converted to Christianity out of motivation for its perceived socio-economic benefits. Shepherd records indigenous people challenging the 17th century Dutch missionaries to provide hard, concrete evidence for the advantages of worshipping the Christian God. He quotes Dutchman Georgius Candidus reporting, with some embarrassment, the way in which the indigenous people were testing the efficacy of Christian worship. They requested him to first teach Christianity to one house in the village, which would adopt Christian beliefs and traditions. Then, Candidus records, quote, if their gods still continued to bless that house by giving much rice and other things during the next 2 or 3 years, they too would willingly adopt our religion, end quote. Candidus was evidently even more embarrassed by indigenous demands to, quote, perform miracles, to give or withhold rain and wind, to foretell future events, or to reveal what is actually occurring elsewhere, end quote, noting with chagrin that, quote, because I cannot do so, they despise me, and say that their priestesses can do all such things, end quote. It seems Candidus never anticipated his teachings would be tested so rigorously. Such records certainly demonstrate that many of the indigenous people were by no means the helpless victims of Christian religious indoctrination, instead responding to missionary preaching with a combination of skepticism and rational practicality. They were certainly not credulous innocents, easily persuaded to abandon their traditional religion for a foreign god. Even when conversions did take place, they were often conditional. Candidus writes that one village, quote, accepted our proposal to do away with their idolatry and to cast away their idols, but said they would defer doing so until the rice crop was gathered in, end quote. Clearly the villagers were intent on hedging their theological bets. Ironically, it was often the indigenous shaman themselves whose actions inadvertently resulted in large-scale conversions to Christianity. Candidus records many of the shaman warning their fellow villagers that conversion to Christianity would result in crop failure and economic disaster. However, this theological throwdown backfired when the crops were unusually plentiful after some of the villagers adopted Christianity. Consequently, Candidus wrote, the shaman were discredited and ridiculed by their own people. Conversions to Christianity increased as a result. Western missionary medical services were another benefit which encouraged conversion. Dr. Huang Xianwei observes that indigenous people quickly realized that Christian missionaries provided more effective medical care, on better terms, than traditional indigenous healers. Huang writes of an indigenous woman of the Amis tribe who converted to Christianity after she became disenchanted by traditional healers because their treatments were unreliable and they always required payments which were difficult for her impoverished family to afford. In contrast, treatments by the missionaries were not only reliably effective, they were also provided completely free of charge. Consequently, Huang writes, quote, Christianity seemed a better alternative for her, end quote. It should be noted that missionaries became aware of the efficacy of their medical treatments as a useful adjunct to preaching, and took full advantage of this fact to discredit both local healers and their traditional religion. However, it can also be said that the local indigenous people who converted were likewise taking advantage of the missionaries in order to secure a significantly better standard of living at no significant cost. Finally, the missionaries' attitude and response to indigenous alcoholism also differentiated them favorably from the Han Chinese colonizers. Hui-wen, lecturer of the University of London, notes that early Chinese scribes typically associated indigenous people with both alcoholism and drunkenness, an image which would, quote, recur over the next few centuries, end quote, in Chinese and indigenous depictions of tribal people. Shepherd notes that the Han Chinese colonizers, quote, noted that the barbarians, that's the indigenous people, had recently been trading deer products for liquor, end quote, and took advantage of the fact that the alcohol they traded to the indigenous people was far stronger than the traditional indigenous millet wine. Shepherd observes that, quote, alcohol sped the deterioration of the Aborigines' economic position, end quote, explaining that indigenous people, quote, might be tricked into signing away land rights while drunk or forced to pledge lands to cover drinking debts at the exorbitant interest rates charged by traders, end quote. In contrast, early Christian missionaries not only deplored the abuse of alcohol, but correctly identified the rise in indigenous alcoholism as a direct product of Han Chinese colonization. Anthropologist Mark Munsterhelm writes that 19th century Presbyterian missionary George Leslie Mackay observed that while alcoholism was unknown among the still independent villages of the Atayal people, quote, among colonized groups, it was common, end quote. Unlike the Han Chinese colonizers, Christian missionaries set up support services to combat indigenous alcoholism. To summarize this section, motivations for the indigenous acceptance of Christianity fall into these broad categories. 1. Military protection from imperialist Han Chinese colonizers. 2. Recognition of shared social values with Christians. 3. Cultural protection from assimilation by Han Chinese colonizers. 4. Socio-economic benefits provided through Christianity. Unlike the Confucianism of the Han Chinese colonizers, Christianity did not require indigenous people to abandon their traditional culture and identity. In fact, the Christian missionaries not only helped indigenous people preserve and learn their own language, their churches also became a haven for the protection of indigenous culture and practices during eras of cultural assimilation by the Han Chinese colonizers of the imperialist Qing dynasty, the Japanese imperialists of the first half of the 20th century, and the Han Chinese invaders of the second half of the 20th century. Additionally, in contrast to the repugnantly alienating ethics and morality of Confucianism, Christian morality was remarkably similar to that of the indigenous people, upholding values which were fundamental to their cultures. It must be noted that the interaction between indigenous religion and Christianity was by no means uniformly harmonious. Taiwan's indigenous people certainly encountered various fanatical Christian missionaries who insisted on them abandoning their traditional religion wholesale and who attempted to suppress indigenous customs. However, indigenous people were quick to counter their influence. Huang notes that such missionaries, quote, aroused a great deal of suspicion and rejection, end quote. Huang writes that when some indigenous people refused to worship their ancestral spirits after converting to Christianity, quote, their relatives in their clan would very often refuse to meet their obligations, end quote, withdrawing assistance from them. However, despite these localized conflicts, and although the Christian missionaries competed theologically with the indigenous shaman, the Christian God, with his angels and saints, was broadly compatible with indigenous concepts of a great spirit and lesser spirits. Consequently, most indigenous people saw no need to abandon worship of the ancestral spirits of their traditional religion. Serving the Christian God appeared to result in superior harvests, and unlike the medical services of local healers, Christian medical services were far more effective and free of charge. Most importantly, indigenous people could see that Christian missionaries had nothing personal to gain from preaching. They were not appropriating land, nor seeking to force indigenous people into exploitative labor programs, nor enriching themselves with indigenous wealth. Huang cites, quote, many studies, end quote, showing that the selflessness and friendliness of Christian missionaries, quote, had a significant effect upon the adoption of Christianity, end quote, particularly when indigenous people, quote, compared the missionaries' zeal with the colonizers' self-interest, end quote. Throughout their centuries of interaction with Christian missionaries, indigenous people could see this was the one foreign group which consistently supported their interests. Professor Jolin Sher of National Donghua University in Taiwan notes that, quote, from the beginning, end quote, the Presbyterian Church, quote, helped the indigenous people deal with problems such as indigenous land rights, trafficking in child prostitution, rights to use indigenous and tribal land, nuclear waste, rights of legislation, cultural crisis, and poverty, end quote. Adding, quote, these churches stand with the indigenous peoples and are in solidarity with their struggle for social justice, end quote. In contrast, Shepherd observes that the Han Chinese colonizers held what he calls contemptuous attitudes towards Aboriginal cultures. Smangus Indigenous Christianity. Members of Smangus do not see Christianity as an exogenous belief which was forced on them by foreign missionaries, but an integral part of their personal religion. The official website of Galang Smangus describes how Christianity was brought to Smangus by an Atayal man, Hui-wen, who was himself a member of the Smangus tribe. After attending a gathering to promote the tribe, Hui-wen returned with the Japanese translation of the New Testament Gospel of John, obtained from an Atayal pastor named Silan Tualu. The Smangus website explains, quote, "This was the beginning of the tribe's belief in Christianity," end quote. Consequently, members of Smangus feel a sense of personal ownership towards Christianity. They feel that they discovered it and took it for themselves. Christianity is an integral part of daily life in Smangus. Journalist Angela Fulton writes that the village work day, quote, "begins at 8 a.m. with a time of prayer and devotions at the village coffee shop," end quote, during which, quote, "a member of the tribe shares thoughts on a passage of scripture and then the pastor leads a prayer," end quote. Nevertheless, the Christianity of Smangus is specifically an indigenous Christianity, integrated harmoniously with traditional Atayal religious beliefs and practices, which continue to be perpetuated. Professor Ai Jingyan of Taiwan's National Zhengzhi University and Dawei Guan, Assistant Research Fellow in the Taiwan Research Institute, quote one of Smangus pastors explaining why there is no conflict between believing in the Atayal Utuh, the ancestral spirit, and Christian teachings, since, quote, "God is the power above all, and Utuh exists under the power," end quote. The pastor also identified the laws of the Christian God as equivalent to the traditional Atayal ethical principles called Gaga, saying, quote, "The rules of church are just the Gaga of God, and we should follow the Gaga of God just as we follow the Gaga taught by ancestors," end quote. Yen and Guan further demonstrate the harmonious relationship between Smangus Christianity and traditional Atayal religion by describing how, quote, "under the organization of church, the residents re-established a traditional ceremony to offer the sacrifice to ancestors," end quote, noting that this ceremony had not been practiced for 50 years, since it was forbidden under the Japanese colonial rule. For Smangus, then, Christianity has been a means of both preserving and reviving indigenous religious beliefs and practices. Consequently, certain aspects of the Smangus life and work ethic are derived primarily from their traditional Atayal religion rather from their Christianity. For example, Zhao Zhiliang and Shu Peixin observe that, quote, "the Smangus people have a particular affinity with trees and plants, believing in the interconnectedness and integration of all physical and spiritual life," end quote. This is derived from their ancestral religion and is expressed by the people of Smangus through traditional rituals which they still practice. As an example, Zhao and Shu explain that, quote, "the chief holds a brief ceremony to pray for everyone's protection before any important meetings or activities," end quote, and describe how, quote, "a local guide conducts a brief ceremony before taking tourists into traditional territory or along the ecotourism, pedestrian and hunting paths," end quote. It should be understood that this prayer is not directed merely to the Christian God, but also to the traditional Atayal ancestral spirits. Additionally, Smangus hunters still continue their traditional ritual of pouring out a cup of millet wine to these spirits before seeking game. Likewise, Zhao and Shu note that members of Smangus continue to, quote, "exchange their personal name with a specific tree in order to prevent illness," end quote, another traditional Atayal religious practice. How Smangus operates. This section describes the way in which Smangus functions as a community. These topics will be covered. 1. General overview. 2. Tnunan and Christianity. 3. Traditional culture and knowledge. 4. Organizational structure. 5. Work culture. 6. Social services. 7. Ecological preservation. 8. Land ownership. General overview. On screen now is an image illustrating the modern history and current operation of Smangus, taken from the paper How Can Social Enterprises Contribute to Sustainable Pro-Poor Tourism Development, published in 2018 by Dr. Benxiang Zheng of Charles Darwin University in Australia. For the benefit of anyone listening to this video but not watching it, I will read verbatim Dr. Zheng's summary of what this diagram illustrates. He writes, quote, "Basically, this model started simply as a tourist service provider to increase financial income. The remoteness, lack of financial capital and infrastructure, and the nature of tourist services forced local community members to work collaboratively. With the increase in tourist numbers and financial income for the community, issues in social and cultural aspects have emerged. This pushes the system to more non-financially oriented changes. How to protect and enhance local culture and tradition and improve local livelihoods has been significantly emphasized. Social cultural well-being, or human well-being, is eventually serving as the top goal of this system in the community." End quote. If you're interested in a detailed description of the diagram, especially if you're listening to this video but not watching it, keep listening while I explain the diagram in depth. Otherwise, use the timestamps in the video description to skip this section and navigate to another part of the video. The diagram's starting point is on the far left, where an arrow provides a brief history of Smangus, marking these key events, described thus. 1979, power available. 1991, giant trees discovered and tourism marketing started. 1995, vehicle access road built. 1999, tourism well established. 2000, the Tnunan system started. See the previous video for my detailed account of these historical events. The arrow then terminates at the starting point of a new arrow in the shape of a large circle, indicating the development of Smangus from 2001 to the present under the new Tnunan system. The arrow is labelled institutional change, and important events in the community's socio-economic and cultural development are displayed sequentially. I will list these events in order, together with a brief explanation of what they refer to. Traditional agricultural system. This refers to Smangus' revival of their original tribal practice of communal land sharing and traditional agricultural methods. Established tourist services. This refers to Smangus' systematic development of new tourism services operating in harmony with the Tnunan system. Increased income. This refers to the significant increase in personal income resulting from participation in the Tnunan system. Active community participation. This refers to the increase in personal involvement in the Smangus community resulting from participation in the Tnunan system. Enhanced culture and tradition. This refers to the way in which Smangus used the Tnunan system to receive, preserve, transmit, and apply their original Atayal culture, as well as integrating their traditional ecological knowledge into the community's ecotourism economy. Improved local livelihoods. This refers to the socio-economic benefits resulting from the Tnunan system, including better employment opportunities and social welfare services such as financial subsidies for healthcare, education, child raising, housing, care for the elderly and infirm, and emergency household funding. Human well-being. This is the terminal point of the arrow, indicating the end goal of Smangus' institutional change. At this terminal point of the institutional change arrow, another arrow leads upwards to a pair of arrows arranged in a circle labelled higher level circle. This indicates the community's ultimate aim to continue improving its systems and services. Within the main institutional change circle are a series of 3 cog or gear shapes, indicating various external and internal forces, organizations, and institutions which help support the community and drive its institutional change. These are color-coded and labelled. The orange gear is labelled external forces, government, NGO, religion, social entrepreneurship, and leadership, eliteship. This illustrates how various exogenous organizations interact with Smangus in support of its goals. The green gear is labelled resource mobilization, integrated management of local assets. This illustrates how Smangus manages and uses its natural resources in the service of both its internal economy and its indigenous culture. The blue gear is labelled organizational culture, integration of ITK traditional culture, and Tnunan, and market culture. This illustrates how Smangus applies its indigenous traditional knowledge, or ITK, and its historical, ethical, and socio-cultural values, the Atayal, to form a culture which both organizes and regulates the community. Overlapping all three gears is an oval shape labelled tourism social enterprise, social cultural mission and economic orientation, cooperative membership, sharing, communal benefits. This illustrates how all of the driving forces supporting Smangus operate under the ethos and core values of the community itself. Finally, a double-ended arrow exiting and entering the center circle is labelled external and internal market, illustrating the way in which the Smangus economy both supports itself and interacts with the economic systems of the capitalist state. Tnunan and Christianity. Although Smangus Christian anarchism was the inspiration for the community's current socio-economic organization and remains its ideological bedrock, the specific details of the Tnunan system, which regulate communities' interaction with the environment, with each other, and with their own culture, derives from their ancestral traditions. Zheng says the Tnunan system, quote, is principally based on Atayal people's lingering memory of the communal spirit, and the practical rules specified by their ancestors, or tok, end quote, adding, quote, the system integrates the traditional Gaga spirit with modern corporate concepts, end quote. Zheng lists several key principles of the Tnunan system: cooperative land management, job sharing, cooperative funds, equal income distribution, and responsibility commitment. These principles are clearly in harmony with anarcho-collectivism. Journalist Oscar Zhong quotes Smangus tribal leader Hui Yi-jen explaining how this principle of sharing was practiced traditionally. Hui says, quote, in the past, when indigenous people returned from the hunt, they would generously share the meat of the mountain boar with everyone, end quote. Hui also adds that under the Tnunan system, this traditional principle is applied far more broadly, saying, quote, now we are sharing the land, taking this culture of sharing to its extreme, end quote. Zheng lists core values of the Tnunan system, such as unity, stability, sharing, and mutual work. This demonstrates how closely the Tnunan system integrates with Smangus Christian anarchism. Job sharing, cooperative funds, equal income distribution, unity, sharing, and mutual love are all values and practices found in the first century Christian community. See the previous video in this series for details. There is a very obvious similarity between Smangus traditional Atayal culture and the Christian anarchism on which they modelled their community. The Tnunan system integrates the beliefs, values, and organizational structure of the first century Christian community with the Atayal, a voluntary regulatory framework for the behavior of community members. The Gaga constitute a traditional code of ethical conduct, and following them is essential to the Atayal identity. In a blog post entitled Bung Hngayang na Lalakhui, Listen to the Voice of the Forest, Atayal pastor Omi Wilang explains the significance of the Gaga with this saying in Atayal: Malu ta Gaga na tayin valaiga, muzata madayan valaila. Translated into English, quote, the person who follows the ancient precepts, the Gaga, is an authentic person, end quote. This harmonious combination of traditional Atayal cultural values and practices with original Christian anarchist praxis and religious doctrine is what characterizes Smangus communal organization as definitively indigenous, Christian, and anarchist. This topic will be covered in greater detail later in this video, but if you want to go there now, just use the timestamps in the video description box to navigate to the section entitled How Anarchist is Smangus? Traditional culture and knowledge. Let's look deeper now into the role of traditional indigenous knowledge in the Smangus community. Of great significance to the Smangus economy is its traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. Zhao and Shu write that the Smangus community considered it essential to take ownership of their TEK and, quote, tell their own story instead of having someone else tell it on their behalf, end quote. Unlike some other indigenous groups in which traditional indigenous knowledge is seen as in competition or conflict with modern scientific knowledge, and is consequently kept separate from it, Smangus' approach to using their traditional ecological knowledge is cooperative and integrative. Professor You Zhang-wu of China Cultural University in Taiwan describes how, quote, scholars cooperated with the community to survey and record flora and fauna species in the mountainous regions, end quote, adding, quote, in such an exchange, Smangus people learnt the values of mainstream societies, end quote. I believe he actually means there the value of mainstream societies. While Smangus community members continue to value highly the traditional ecological knowledge accumulated by their ancestors, they have also welcomed mutually beneficial exchanges of ecological knowledge with professional biologists, rather than seeing contemporary science as a threat. Instead of feeling the need to compete with modern science, or privilege traditional understandings of nature and insulate them from scientific scrutiny, Smangus residents recognize that modern scientific research and methodologies can be used to both complement and improve their ancestral understanding of nature. Yu writes that the Smangus community sent some of its young people to universities, and one of them returned with a master's degree, with the result that, quote, the Smangus people were able to systematically integrate traditional knowledge and contemporary knowledge, and consequently update their knowledge system, end quote. Despite their thousands of years of historical occupation in Taiwan, the Atayal people of Smangus recognize there is still more they can learn about their natural environment by studying modern scientific ecological findings. Their openness to non-traditional forms of knowledge and willingness to accept that ancestral environmental wisdom may be incomplete or even wrong has enabled them to take advantage of professional research resulting from the scientific method. Yu notes that Smangus is similarly willing to embrace technological progress which complements and improves their application of traditional practices and knowledge, writing, quote, mastering new technologies enabled the Smangus people to record tribal history and environmental data and map this information in a geographical context, which also enriched the contents of their ecotourism business by providing guided tours for tourists, end quote. Yu further observes that digitizing this information improved Smangus' ability to, quote, accumulate experiences to enrich their knowledge system for future generations to inherit, end quote. The Atayal people of Smangus do not view the acceptance and integration of modern scientific knowledge and methods as a betrayal of their historic indigenous culture or destructive to their ancestral traditions. Crucially, they understand that it is natural for culture to change over time, that cultural authenticity does not require cultural stagnation or fossilization, and that as long as their culture is self-determined, it is not degraded by alteration and development, even when it is changed by the importation of exogenous skills and knowledge. Zhao and Shu write that the Smangus community acknowledges that, quote, TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, is contextual, dynamic, and continually being revised, end quote. As an example, they quote a villager in Smangus saying, quote, we did not have any tradition in woodcraft, but it doesn't mean that we cannot have it in the future, end quote. This is an important observation in the context of modern debates over what constitutes authentic indigenous culture. To make this point stronger, Zhao and Shu also quote Dr. Mark Stevenson, Aboriginal Program Manager at the University of Alberta in Canada, writing, quote, Aboriginal people possess knowledge and experiences not grounded in traditional lifestyles, spirituality, philosophy, social relations, and cultural values, end quote. Zhao and Shu take care to emphasize that, quote, rather than being forced upon them, end quote, Smangus ecotourism is an endogenous bottom-up project, quote, occurring under the direction of the Smangus tribe, end quote, citing this as one of the reasons for its success. They also identify, quote, strengthening tribal sovereignty, thriving sustainable ecotourism, and transmission of knowledge, end quote, as additional contributing factors. Finally, Zhao and Shu cite the important role of traditional ecological knowledge in the management of Smangus local ecology, writing, quote, the traditional management of plants in the Smangus region is a good example of how the many facets of TEK are interwoven to provide ecological sustainability, end quote. Organizational structure. On screen now is a chart illustrating Smangus organizational structure. This image is a reproduction of a smaller version of the same chart found in the article Taiwan's Smangus, an indigenous village with an ecotourism cooperative by Pino Wu, an environmental services professional in Taipei. Please note that although the chart depicts various organizational units within Smangus in a pyramid shape, this is not an indication of structural hierarchy, but an illustration of how the different groups interact with each other. Instead of being read vertically from the top down, the chart should be read radially from the center out. You should also bear in mind that although there are 15 different organizational units in this structure, the entire population of Smangus is only 200 people, so most of the community participates in several of these organizational units simultaneously. Consequently, members of one unit are often organizing and facilitating the work which they themselves will carry out in their capacity in another unit. The three core organizational units, the Tnunan Tribal Council, Church, and Co-op, are at the center of the pyramid, proving that this is not a hierarchy. These three constitute Smangus' integral structure. The Tnunan Tribal Council represents Smangus' traditional indigenous knowledge and customs, the Church represents the Smangus Christian religion, and the Co-op represents Smangus' common ownership of land and the means of production. These three core units interact with each other cooperatively and laterally, not hierarchically. In the same way, the unit at the top of the chart, labeled Muruhu, or chief in the Atayal language, is not an indication of a hierarchically instituted authority figure commanding the entire community. The Muruhu is an organizational position to which individuals are elected. La Hui Yi-jen, director of the Education and Culture Department of Smangus Tribal Council, explains Smangus' organizational structure in this way. Quote, the Tnunan is organized in a 3-in-1 structure. The term 3-in-1 refers to the Tribal Development Association, the Tnunan Smangus Tribal Council, and the Smangus Church, the faith center of the tribe, which leads the tribe to promote various tasks through unification of the three organizations. Although the overall structure in this chart may look complicated, in reality most of it simply consists of committees with a few work groups. La Hui explains the relationship between the other organizational units and how they interact, writing, quote, the organizational structure comprises 3 committees, 9 departments, and a director general. Each department divides the work between them and works together to promote the tribe's development. End quote. The tribal council's role is to organize and coordinate the work of the various other units shown on the chart: education and culture, engineering, environment, land and agriculture, human resources, financial, health and welfare, tourism, research and innovation. As this list of organizational units suggests, the Smangus economy incorporates a range of industries. Zheng explains that although tourism remains the community's main source of income, quote, other activities are still practiced, including agricultural activities such as growing fruit, local grains, and vegetables, end quote. Work culture. Journalist Angela Fulton reports that at the start of the working day, members of the community are assigned individual jobs. This may seem rather hierarchical and even dictatorial, quite contrary to the spirit of anarchism. However, journalist Oscar Zhong explains, quote, the jobs that are part of the daily routine for community members are assigned based on individual abilities and interests, end quote. This ensures everyone is doing the job they prefer and are most proficient at. However, at the same time, certain job responsibilities are rotated throughout the community every couple of months, partly to improve everyone's skills with a range of jobs, and partly to divide the more mundane tasks equitably among the community. Zhong adds that 80% of the Smangus community are members of the co-op, sharing the work among them. That leaves the question of what happens with those people who haven't joined the Tnunan. This will be addressed later, but if you want to jump to it now, use the timestamps in the video description to navigate to the section How Anarchist is Smangus. Tribal leader La Hui Yi-jen provides another detail of the working day, which not only emphasizes the cooperative nature of the labor culture, but also raises additional questions about how Smangus is organized. He writes, quote, during work hours, tribal members eat communally, reducing the work burden on the village's women, end quote. From this statement, it is clear that cooking and providing meals is predominantly the work of the women. Does this mean labor in Smangus is segregated by gender? Formally, no. Members of both genders are free to perform almost any kind of work they choose. Informally, yes. Traditional Atayal culture segregated labor according to a strict gender binary, Men did men's work and women did women's work, and modern Smangus reflects the long-standing influence of this tradition. This is another issue which will be addressed in detail later in this video. If you want to find out about it now, use the timestamps in the video description box to navigate to the section Internal and External Challenges and the subheading Gender Knowledge and Labour Imbalance. Fulton describes various work regulations, quote, drinking or smoking on the job, illegally cutting trees, taking too many days off, or skipping church results in docked pay, end quote. She adds, quote, the tribe will also suspend a student's funding if he skips class or earns low grades, end quote. If you're concerned about how this fits into a supposedly anarchist community, use the timestamps in the video description to navigate to the section How Anarchist is Smangus. Fulton also explains what happens when people leave the village, writing, quote, students who graduate from college and want to work in the cities are allowed to leave, but they must work for a year to pay back their education costs, and men lose their rights to the land, end quote. Note that students are not required to repay their education costs if they remain in the village. The purpose of this repayment is to compensate the community for the loss of labour resulting from the student leaving the village. The loss of the right to communal land when people leave the village prevents people accumulating private property, living outside the community while profiting from land being worked by others rather than themselves. The idea is that if someone is not working on the land as part of the community, then they have no right to claim ownership of it. This is a case of an anarchist principle being applied in a way which subverts traditional indigenous understandings of land ownership as well as modern legal rulings. An important feature of Smangus work culture is egalitarian compensation. Zhong notes, quote, each co-op member receives a monthly salary of 20,000 Taiwan dollars regardless of what job they do, end quote. That's about $700 US. Social services. Zhong writes, quote, a good welfare system further underpins the stability of residents' lives, with all kinds of fees, including medical and educational, being borne by the collective, end quote. Zheng describes the social welfare system in detail, explaining that Smangus Cooperative Fund provides these social welfare benefits: a marriage grant, free healthcare, child support benefits, an old age pension for people over 60 years old, free education, including up to college level, 8 days of paid annual leave, a housing subsidy for new dwellings, and an emergency fund for unexpected needs. Tribal elder Lahui Ije explains that Smangus also has its own elementary school. Ecological preservation. Journalist Angela Fulton writes, quote, the Smangus have fought for years to keep their land out of the hands of Taiwan's Forestry Bureau, believing the tribe is best suited to care for the land, end quote. Preservation of the Smangus ecology starts with restrictions on the number of people who can enter. Tribal leader Lahui Ije explains that entering Smangus requires an application for a pass at the Shouluan checkpoint in Jianshe Township. It may seem odd for an anarchist community to have something which looks like a formal border, but this is not a border in the political sense like a state border, which is defended by force. Instead, this is a means of regulating the number of people who enter the village in order to preserve the ecology. In this way, it's no different to the same kind of pass which is necessary to enter Taiwan's national parks. Fulton says, quote, the Smangus cap the number of visitors at 250 a day, end quote. That was the limit in 2019. Lahui Ije also lists a number of regulations prohibiting various forms of damage to the environment, such as picking or bending flowers, littering, hunting animals, destroying vegetation or starting fires, polluting the air or water, driving vehicles outside designated areas, or fishing by shooting, electrocution, or poisoning. Lahui also writes, quote, it is strictly forbidden to leave the tour group, enter non-travel areas without authorization, or take shortcuts, end quote. Again, these are the same kinds of prohibitions which are standard elsewhere in Taiwan's national parks, and their purpose is to protect the local environment from human exploitation. Fulton notes that ecological preservation is not only an integral part of village activity, citing the way community members, quote, prevent illegal logging, maintain trails, and educate tourists about local plants and animals, end quote, but also part of the transmission of Smangus Atayal culture, which is taught at the local school. The paper, An Application of Sustainable Development in Indigenous Peoples Revival, The History of an Indigenous Tribe's Struggle in Taiwan, by Professor Yu, describes in considerable detail how principles of ecological preservation govern every activity in Smangus. Yu explains how members of Smangus, quote, largely use natural materials to construct their accommodation, end quote, relying mainly on fallen trees and other forest debris in order to reduce their impact on the local environment. For the same reason, Yu says, the community has established carefully curated trails in order to guide tourists through the forest with minimal impact, adding, quote, the trail is kept as primitive as possible to avoid interruption to the environment, end quote. Although members of Smangus continue their traditional practice of hunting, Yu writes, quote, they use natural materials to set traps to catch animals, rather than using large animal traps or gunfire to slaughter animals, end quote. At the heart of Smangus care for the environment is the Atayal Garah, the traditional tribal ethical code handed down by the ancestors. Yu explains that Smangus ecological preservation practice is motivated by the community's desire to, quote, obey their Garah, in which Smangus people only hunted and gathered what they need without exceeding necessity, end quote. Land ownership. The topic of land ownership in Smangus is complex and has been fraught with legal difficulties. In the absence of sovereign rights to their land, the Smangus community has struggled to achieve a communal ownership model which is in harmony with their Christian anarchist vision, in continuity with their traditional Atayal culture, and legally recognized by the state. It would be very easy to get lost in the years of struggle during which Smangus has sought to define and establish the community's relationship to its ancestral land, but for the purposes of this video, a brief overview will suffice. In this section, I am relying on the dissertation A Post-Colonial Perspective of the State's Registration of Traditional Cultural Expressions, published in 2019 by Professor Chih-ching, as well as the Galang Smangus Tribal Covenant of 2004. The covenant itself, though relatively short, is detailed enough to warrant a separate video by itself, but here I will confine myself to the details relevant to land ownership. Since the covenant is in Chinese, I will be citing Hong's English translation and commentary. The challenge faced by Smangus was that Taiwan law recognizes private ownership of land, but not the specific form of communal ownership which the tribe wished to institute. There was no provision within Taiwanese law for a legal model which matched the tribe's understanding of communal land ownership. Consequently, Smangus was compelled to find a legal equivalent, or at least approximation, of the tribal model. As mentioned in the previous video, at the end of 2004, the tribe formed a covenant establishing the entity Tnunan Smangus, meaning communally owned Smangus. All members of the covenant agreed that their previously privately owned land would now be owned by Tnunan Smangus, the organization representing the entire community. Basically speaking, and this is basic, it's not a technical description, with legal ownership of the land transferred to the Tnunan and individuals legally joining the Tnunan, the land would consequently be collectively owned, at least effectively, by all members of the Tnunan. In this way, communal ownership of the entire land could be achieved within the limitations of the state's legal apparatus. Article 3 of the Smangus Covenant states that the land of Smangus is not to be sold, rented, or otherwise transferred to anyone outside the community, and prohibits any member forming an agreement with anyone outside Smangus to manage or invest in the community's land. Article 4 of the Covenant explicitly prohibits any tribal land being used on a significant scale without the express consent of the entire tribe, established through discussion and consensus. Hong explains that through the articles of their covenant, quote, the tribe designed a way to manage their land and seek a balance of private property under the modern state's legal system and communal property under the tribe's management, end quote. I stated previously that the Smangus communal land ownership model is in continuity with their traditional Atayal culture. I chose this phrasing specifically in order to reflect the fact that land ownership within the Tnunan Smangus is not entirely traditional. Instead, it is a compromise between tribal concepts and modern legislation. Consequently, Hong says, quote, the sense of property is not traditional. It is a merging of traditional and modern. End quote. Importantly, Hong also notes that the primary motivation behind what she calls Smangus, quote, innovative property management, end quote, is, quote, not the conventional aim of the capital market or modern property law, end quote, but instead, quote, the protection of tribal environment and ecology, end quote. Coming from Hong, an intellectual property professional, this is an insightful observation on the purpose and function of legislation within the capitalist state. How anarchist is Smangus? To what extent can Smangus be identified as anarchist? I expect that this will be one of the most frequently viewed sections of this video, so I'll cover this in some detail. There's easily sufficient material on this subject for a detailed video of its own, but I'll aim to address it efficiently under these topics. 1. Abolition of hierarchy. 2. Voluntary participation. 3. Abolition of private property. 4. Communally owned means of production. This section will present evidence that Smangus meets this characterization and is consequently an anarcho-collectivist community as defined by 19th century anarcho-collectivist Zhang Guiyam in his 1876 work Ideas on the Organization of Society. Abolition of hierarchy. Dr. Ben Xiangzheng of Charles Darwin University in Australia observes that the community organization of Smangus, quote, has been driven by local elites and local community members and is totally a bottom-up approach, end quote. By local elites, he does not mean hierarchical leaders, but members of the community who were originally of higher socio-economic status. Importantly, Zheng's description highlights the way in which Smangus collectivism has been an entirely grassroots movement, resulting from a process of discussion and consensus building among the community. It has not been enforced on the community through any kind of hierarchical process. This is entirely in keeping with traditional Atayal culture, which has always been essentially non-hierarchical. Professor Ai Jingyan of Taiwan's National Zhengzhi University and Dawei Guan, Assistant Research Fellow in the Taiwan Research Institute, observe, quote, there is no obvious social class in the traditional Atayal society, end quote. They add that aside from the tribal position of Muruhu, commonly translated chief or leader, there is no hierarchy of upper and lower classes, unlike in some of Taiwan's other indigenous tribes. Of course, the position of a chief does sound incompatible with a non-hierarchical social structure, so let's look at that in more detail. Firstly, Yan and Guan explain that the Atayal Muruhu was not a hereditary position, although in some areas and in some circumstances this was contravened, and that the Muruhu was elected to their place by the community on the basis of their ability. They add that when a Muruhu becomes too old to fulfill their duties, a new election will be held. Atayal society was organized according to various groups of individuals, each carrying out specific functions and working with each other for the good of the tribe. These groups were motivated by an ethic of cooperation and sharing. The Kuduk Gaga, or ritual group, held and taught the tribe's ancestral cultural knowledge and carried out the ceremonies for religious occasions. The Kuduk Kenuekan, or labor group, consisted of individuals or groups within the tribe working together on various tasks. This was not a standing group. Individual tribe members would simply volunteer and work collaboratively as needed in the same way as an anarchist collective. The Inhoyan Kuduk Linatan, or hunting group, were likewise a collection of volunteer hunters who would provide for the entire tribe, sharing their food equally on their return. This same principle of voluntary participation in different work groups is followed in Smangus. Individuals volunteer for various work groups, and are assigned tasks matching their skills and preferences. Journalist Oscar Zhong says, quote, "The jobs that are part of the daily routine for community members are assigned based on individual abilities and interests," end quote. This not only prevents tasks being assigned hierarchically or through favoritism, but also ensures individuals are given the work they are best at and most interested in. Dr. Benxiang Zheng makes the same observation. However, most importantly, he adds another detail demonstrating the non-hierarchical organization of Smangus. Zheng writes, quote, "The Tnunan members are allocated jobs according to their abilities and capacities with a fixed salary no matter what jobs they do," end quote. Zhong later makes the same comment, saying, quote, "Each co-op member receives a monthly salary of 20,000 Taiwan dollars, regardless of what job they do," end quote. That's around $700 US. In summary, Smangus follows the same non-hierarchical community organization of its traditional tribal culture. Individuals are elected to leadership positions, individuals volunteer for work groups, labor is assigned according to individuals on the basis of their abilities and interests, and workers all receive the same pay for their labor. There is no social hierarchy. Voluntary participation. Participation in the Tnunan system is entirely voluntary. Zheng writes, quote, "Community members voluntarily participate in the Tnunan with full commitment of Tnunan principles and the input of all of their assets, including lands, into the organization," end quote. This means that it is entirely possible for members of Smangus to opt out of or simply never opt into the Tnunan. It is not enforced on anyone. Consequently, as noted previously, there are still some members of the village who do not belong to the Tnunan. However, I have made reference to Smangus' framework for social regulation, enshrined in the tribal gaga. Yen and Guan write that gaga, quote, "also refers to the regulations a member needs to follow," end quote. Can a society have social regulations of this kind and still be considered anarchist? Sociologist Thomas Bottomore noted that behavioral regulation is a typical feature of human social groups, but he differentiated between various forms of social control. Bottomore wrote, quote, "Social control as the regulation of behavior by values and norms is to be contrasted with regulation by force," end quote. This distinction is of particular relevance to anarchism, since anarchists typically understand hierarchy as authority exercised through force or the threat of force, and insist on voluntary participation in communities and voluntary adherence to social norms. Sociologist George Homans made this distinction acutely, writing, quote, "The process by which conformity is achieved we call social control if we are thinking of compliance with norms, or authority if we are thinking of obedience to orders," end quote. He added that small groups typically manage social control through voluntary adherence to norms, while it is only when groups become large and conflicting morals emerge that, quote, "informal controls yield priority to those that are formal, such as laws and codes," end quote. Developing this idea further, sociologists Jeffrey Shantz and Dana Williams comment, quote, "Although norms may be roughly understood as social rules, this should not be contradictory to anarchism," end quote, adding that rules are, quote, "not necessarily bad according to anarchists if such rules are collectively agreed upon," end quote. Similarly, Saul Newman, a political theorist and self-described post-anarchist, writes, quote, "In an anarchist community, there would indeed be rules and ethical limits which are democratically decided," end quote, observing that the creation of community itself requires some form of obligations and social boundaries in order to form and define it. It is also important to assess the aim of social regulations, such as norms and mores. Anarchists are in favor of regulations on human behavior which are for the benefit of the entire community and which serve the common good, especially those which are for the protection of natural resources and which help maintain trust and cooperative interaction between members of the community. Conversely, anarchists are against regulations serving to privilege some individuals over others. A comprehensive analysis of the entire Galang Smangus covenant would necessitate an entirely separate video, and a fine-grained study would highlight a few regulations requiring examination in detail in order to test whether or not they are congruent with an anarchist society. However, insofar as the regulations of Smangus aim to benefit the entire community, eliminate privilege and hierarchy, and protect natural resources for the common good, I believe they are well within the boundaries of the voluntary norms acceptable to typical anarchist societies. Abolition of private property. To a large extent, this has been addressed previously. However, in this section, I'll examine it in more specific detail. Firstly, it is indisputable that the Tnunan system ensures that legally, as well as socially, the land of Smangus is owned entirely by all community members, preventing private ownership. Zeng writes, quote, "The communal system manages the land on behalf of all community members who voluntarily authorized the association to manage their lands and assets based on a collective ownership rather than individually private ownership." End quote. Zeng argues that since land use and management decisions are now made through the Tnunan system, quote, "the collective ownership has a stronger resilience towards unwilling changes in land and assets in the communities." End quote. By this he means that not only is the land use organized and managed in a better way than it was when owned by individuals, it is also more resistant to external factors which threaten the ecology or the community's organization, such as natural disasters or interference by the government or other self-interested third parties. I will now show part of an interview with Smangus tribal elder Masai Solung, who provides his perspective on the importance of the collective ownership of land and explains some of the reasons why it was considered essential to prevent land becoming private property. Since the interview is in Chinese, the video of this interview will play at a reduced volume level while I read an English translation of Masai's words. You can use YouTube's closed captions option if you need subtitles in English. Our tribe is grateful that we were able to achieve a very difficult goal, which is joint tenancy of land. We finally achieved it in 2004, joint tenancy of land. It was a major mission that our former tribal chief set into action. His intention was to take advantage of the fact that now the Taiwanese government allowed indigenous people to claim ownership of land. And in our opinion, if every tribe had had the ownership of reservation land, then it would have been easy for people to have selfish motives and sell the land to big companies. So our former tribal chief pointed out this issue, and if that had happened, we wouldn't have been able to protect our land. And in our opinion, if every tribe had had the ownership of reservation land, then it would have been easy for people to have selfish motives and sell the land to big companies. So our former tribal chief pointed out this issue, and if that had happened, we wouldn't have been able to protect our land. So the only way to keep our land out of the hands of big companies was joint tenancy of land. With joint tenancy of land, no one in the tribe would have a chance to sell our land. We achieved this goal, and we were so relieved because we could finally stop big companies and the government from interfering in our land. These days, the Taiwan government loves to use urban planning to still try and have a hand in our land. So we use this method to stop them, to protect our land. To conclude this section, I will quote one more comment from Zeng, highlighting an important aspect of the Tnunan's common ownership of land. Zeng writes, quote, "As indicated by Zhao and Shu, this sharing and income distribution is actually ownership-based rather than work-based or labor-based. The unique income distribution and social well-being system highlights the social value and the pro-poor nature of this model." End quote. Commonly owned means of production. This topic is essentially connected with the previous point, since the Smangus economy is fundamentally dependent on the land itself. Common ownership of the land not only eliminates private property, but also collectivizes the means of production. Consequently, tribal elder Hui-wen writes, quote, "The most important breakthrough has been the land commons system, which manages tribal land collectively, so that households participating in the organization have no private land. It is all owned collectively by the tribe." End quote. La Hui describes Smangus collectively owned land synonymously with the means of production, citing the Kamaya, the agricultural land, and the Kuyanam, the hunting grounds. As Zheng describes it, all participants, in the name of Tnunan, co-own and co-manage the assets and services. End quote. I will now show part of another interview with Smangus tribal elder Masai Solung. In this section of the interview, he explains the importance of Smangus collective land ownership. You will note that he says he tells the children of Smangus that ownership of this means of production enables them to be economically independent. He tells them they won't have to work for a boss and do what they're told or be fired, nor will they need to be dependent on government handouts or large companies. So I often say to our young people that in our own land, we can create our future, and we can make a living here. We are free people. When you work in the outside world, you have to listen to your boss. If you don't follow his rules, he will fire you. That life is not easy. So we've been telling our children, as long as you put effort into tribal tourism, you are the owner, you are the boss. You can use your great ideas to develop your tribe. You don't need to rely on government funding or help from big companies. What you need to rely on is the wisdom our ancestor passed on, which is to cherish the land, cherish your own people. This is what we've been telling our children. This demonstrates that the members of Smangus have not only deliberately collectivized the means of production, they are also totally aware of the positive economic consequences of this step and the way in which it maintains their independence. They have established a community which is self-sufficient to the extent that it can provide work and economic security for their children, eliminating the need for them to participate in the capitalist state. How successful is Smangus? This is the most enjoyable section of this script to write, and I expect it will be one of the most well-viewed sections of the final video. The simple fact is that Smangus has been tremendously successful in its 18 years. I will introduce this section with a quotation from Zheng before moving on to details. Zheng writes, quote, "Nowadays, Smangus has become one of the most prosperous indigenous communities in Taiwan, and it has been transformed into a shining example of sustainable rural tourism development." End quote. Now let's look in detail at these aspects of Smangus' success. 1. Social welfare. 2. Income equality. 3. Reduced alcoholism. 4. Sustainable community. 5. Sustainable ecotourism. Social welfare. An earlier section of this video described in detail the various forms of social welfare Smangus provides for its members, including free healthcare, free education up to and including university, financial support for marriages and building a new house, a child support subsidy for children up to primary school age, an old age pension for individuals aged 60 years and over, 8 days of paid annual leave, and emergency funding for households with unexpected needs. This is already a significant achievement for a small community, but it is not all. In 2018, journalist Oscar Zhong cited tribal leader Hui-wen saying that over time, the value of the social benefits paid out to community members has increased. As an example, he cites the child support subsidy for children under 2 years old, which was 4 times larger in 2018 than it was in 2007. Income equality. We have already seen previously that workers in Smangus receive the same monthly salary regardless of the work they do. Even more importantly, that monthly salary has been increasing steadily over the years, from 10,000 Taiwan dollars in 2004 to 16,000 Taiwan dollars in 2015, then 20,000 Taiwan dollars in 2018. That's an increase from around 330 US dollars to 700 US dollars over 14 years, not only staying well ahead of the national rate of inflation, but also increasing far faster than the national rate of wage increase. Zheng notes that as a result of the combined efforts of the collectivized means of production and the equal salary for all workers, quote, the income inequality among community members has drastically decreased, end quote. Professors Jinping Tang and Cui-xin Deng, cited by Zheng, provide additional detail, saying that not only has income inequality fallen dramatically, but also, quote, the negative impact of ecotourism on the environment has been greatly reduced, end quote. Reduced alcoholism. As mentioned earlier in this video, alcoholism is a long-standing problem in Taiwan's indigenous communities, and historically, Smangus has not been immune. However, tribal elder拉互依.倚岕writes that as a result of Smangus' Tnunan system, quote, everyone has devoted themselves to the common goal, and everyone in the tribe has their own work, end quote.拉互依clearly understands the significance of community members having a stable and reliable income and regular and satisfying work, observing that, quote, this cooperation and consensus has produced a restraining effect, end quote. Drawing a direct connection between Smangus collectivism and their efforts to combat alcoholism, he writes, quote, although alcoholism still exists, it has been reduced to single digits, and support is also provided through the church and external organizations, end quote. This is an admirable achievement. Sustainable community. One of Smangus' most important goals is the sustainability of the entire community. That is, the community remains economically viable for the foreseeable future. The success of the last 18 years demonstrates that Smangus has achieved this. Journalist Oscar Zhong writes, quote, after 18 years of co-op activity, Smangus today, through a refined division of labor and integrated management of resources, has developed a tourism industry that brings in considerable income, enabling it to provide all kinds of welfare support to community members, thus achieving the goal of letting everyone live settled and contented lives, end quote. He adds that not only has Smangus successfully stopped the typical indigenous problem of community members leaving the village in search of employment, this process has now been reversed, as former members of Smangus who had previously left the community are now able to return to work there. This demonstrates that Smangus has indeed achieved sustainability. Sustainable ecotourism. Ecotourism is critical to Smangus' socio-economic health and long-term survivability. Here again, Smangus has achieved great success, especially in comparison with other ecotourism ventures in Taiwan. Zhao and Shu write that Smangus, quote, represents an exception in community-based ecotourism development because of their strong sovereignty, appropriate institutions, and self-determination, end quote. They credit this to Smangus' careful management of forestry and wildlife for sustainable use, as well as the tribe's ability to organize and carry out any projects necessary for its aims. Zhao and Shu praise Smangus' sustainable ecotourism for its, quote, conservation and development at the local level, end quote. They also cite the unique features of Smangus' economic model, which they observe are, quote, designed in accordance with traditional Smangus communalism, end quote. Professors Jinping Tang and Cui Xin-deng note that two nearby Atayal villages both started their own ethno-ecotourism industries nearly simultaneously with Smangus. However, they describe these villages as having significantly poorer results. Tang and Deng's words are worth quoting in full since they speak volumes about the value of Smangus collectivism. They write, quote, "Tourists visiting these free market villages expressed their concerns with the ongoing ecological deterioration in the nearby forest, and indeed, these villages suffered much more serious mudslides than Smangus during the typhoon seasons." End quote. It is important to repeat the key observation made by Tang and Deng. They compared the results of the, quote, free market villages, end quote, with the results of the collectivist Smangus community, and found that Smangus ecotourism was significantly more successful, exhibiting far higher levels of sustainability, less damage to the environment, and greater resistance to natural disasters. Simply put, when compared with two ecotourism villages operating in the capitalist free market, Smangus' anarcho-collectivist approach demonstrated far superior outcomes. Summary. I'll end this section with a quotation from Zeng, which summarizes the extent of Smangus' success. Note that this was written in 2018. Quote, "Through cooperative membership mechanisms, the social enterprise led by local elites has achieved outstanding commercial success, enhanced social-cultural values, and also established an enviable social welfare system which is owned by Smangus itself. Nowadays, the tribe receives more than 60,000 tourists and gains tourism revenue of over 20 million Taiwan dollars, roughly $650,000 US. End quote. Commentary from Smangus elders. In this section, I will be showing video from interviews with two of Smangus tribal elders, Hui-wen and Masai Solung. Since the interviews are in Chinese, the video of the interview will be played at a reduced volume level while I read an English translation of their words. You can use YouTube's closed captions option if you need subtitles in English. In a few cases, you'll notice I've added or changed a word just to complete the sense in English. In this first interview, Masai Solung describes why Galang Smangus is unique, why it was chosen by the tribe's ancestor Makus, and how the tribe has built a sustainable ecotourism industry for the benefit of its children and for the preservation of its ancestral heritage. The geographic position of our tribe is in a special location. It's in the middle of the northern part of Taiwan. A lot of Atayal people decided to relocate in other places, but our ancestor Makus couldn't leave here. He felt this place belonged to him. For him, this place was deep in the mountains, which provided a sense of security. Being far, far away from the plains, this place was like a castle deep in the mountains. So he loved this place. So they really loved this place. They loved the location of Smangus. However, about 30 years ago, a news reporter described Smangus as a dark place without transportation and electricity, and it seemed like a secluded village. This description actually reflects our ancestors' choice. He chose to settle here because this place was secluded. In this interview, Masai is answering these questions. 1. What did you do to make young people stay in the tribe voluntarily to promote and transmit Atayal culture? 2. How do you teach them the culture and make them stay? I think this question is related to my answer to the previous question regarding education. Our tribe cares about education because education plays an important role in the sustainability of an ethnic group. So our tribe values our children's education. This is also our generation's mission. If we don't put education in the first place, we will lose the chance to teach children about our culture, and what our children will be taught might be through the materials prepared by the government. Consequently, our tribe and the culture will not last. Even though we're under the power of the government, we show no fear. Even though we're under the power of the government, we show no fear. This means we will fight for the opportunity for our Smangus children to stay and to receive education in our tribe so that they can learn about our native culture as well as other foreign cultures. Therefore, they will be wise in the future. This is also what we aim at. As I just mentioned, why do our young people, why do most of them stay in the tribe? We do have a goal that our children here can leave the tribe to pursue higher education after junior high school. If they can't make it to college, it's okay, but they must return to the tribe. Don't hang around in the outside world and lose their inner selves. Don't take advantage of that. We often encourage our children when they are young not to waste their strength in other places. If they have the strength to help people, they should devote their strength to the tribe. This is what we've been telling our children. So we, our tribe, want our children to enhance our own value. We've strived to turn our settlement into a sustainable business. We used the land passed on by our ancestors. We restored the land and then used the land, used the forest handed down by our ancestors. Our forest. We promote our forest to the outside world so people in cities can come and enjoy the natural environment. When we have visitors, we can make money. Then our young people will have the energy to go on and will be confident that they can make a living here, in the tribe. They don't really need to move to a city for work. In this part of the same interview, Masai explains how grateful he is that so few of Smangus young people are living outside the community and that so many of them return as soon as they are able. So our young people, only a very few are still in other places, except for those studying or serving their military service. Most of them return to the tribe as soon as they complete their military service. We also thank God for giving us this land, and because of His love, we can live together in unity in the tribe. Secondly, I thank our ancestors.
School.
internal and external challenges. In this final section, I take an honest look at these challenges Smangus is facing. Firstly, the internal challenges. 1. Community conflicts. 2. Lack of on-site medical services. 3. Gender knowledge and labour imbalance. 4. Loss of traditional ecological knowledge. Secondly, the external challenges. 1. Friction with other tribes. 2. Government interference. Internal challenges. Community conflicts. Writing in 2019, journalist Angela Fulton notes that the transition to Smangus collectivization was controversial, reporting, quote, "Those with much land struggled to share it with those who had little. Some complained that each member would receive the same salary regardless of his abilities," end quote. She quotes Benuch Masai, son of tribal leader Masai Sulung, saying, quote, "We had many rough patches, and there were disagreements and discussions. We had to go back to the Bible's teaching about sharing with one another and giving to those in need. I believe our faith is the reason we can sustain this system until today," end quote. Fulton also records that, quote, "Not all tribal members have opted to join the commune," end quote, saying around 20% have continued to operate their own private businesses. Journalist Oscar Zhong cites tribal elder Hui-wen (倚岕) commenting that even among those who have joined the Tnunan collective, a small number are taking advantage of the system. In Zhong's words, they, quote, "have the mindset of eating from the communal pot without doing much work," end quote. Zhong also quotes Hui commenting on the disciplinary measures implemented to prevent people working under the influence of alcohol, saying, quote, "For example, we don't allow drinking alcohol while working. Otherwise, your annual bonus will be cut in half or by even more if you do it again," end quote. Noting that in 2018, the annual bonus rose to 80,000 Taiwan dollars, around $2,800 US, Hui says, quote, "We take the issue of drinking very seriously and even spent 20,000 Taiwan dollars to buy breathalyzers, which we use for random tests," end quote. Other conflicts have been more serious. Professor You Zheng-yu describes an incident in April 2012 when a group of men were arrested by Taiwan's police for illegal logging. Among the group were men from the Smangus community. Yu explains that these men were from a family which did not join the Tnunan collective. The offenders had entered another tribe's territory and conducted illegal logging operations, which Yu describes as, quote, "a serious offense in the Atayal's lokah," end quote. Yu records that the Smangus tribal leader visited the tribe which had suffered the incursion, making a formal apology with the ritual blood sacrifice of an animal in a traditional reconciliation ceremony. Yu quotes the Smangus leader expressing regret over the incident, but commenting that it was also an important teaching moment for the community, especially the young people. The elder added, quote, "The rationale to conduct the Tbalai ritual, the blood sacrifice, is to show them, the Atayal society, and the mainstream societies, that we, Atayal people, are serious about our traditions," end quote. Yu concludes that the incident was of great importance since Smangus has become an informal representative of the Atayal people in Taiwan, so it was vital that Smangus be seen as upholding the Atayal lokah. Internal challenges. Lack of on-site medical services. Smangus is 3 to 4 hours drive away from the nearest urban centre up narrow and winding mountain roads which are frequently rendered dangerous or even impassable by local climatic conditions. Consequently, supplying Smangus with medical services has proved to be a significant challenge. Medical care is currently supplied by vehicles sent by Mackay Memorial Hospital, a private hospital built by Christian missionaries in 1912. In an article by Formosa News in 2015, tribal elder Hui-wen explained that staff in Smangus have been given instruction in basic first aid as well as first responder and emergency medical care. However, he also described significant gaps in Smangus medical services, saying, quote, "This rural area needs more than emergency medical care. It also lacks basic treatment for body aches and orthopedic examination, and work-related injuries and medical rehabilitation." End quote. Recent travel guides to Smangus still advise that only basic medical care is available on site. Gender knowledge and labour imbalance. Traditional Atayal culture was segregated according to a strict gender binary. The Atayal people recognized only two sexes, male and female, and two genders, man and woman, and Atayal culture divided labour by gender. Men hunted, fought and led the tribe, while women gathered plants, cooked, wove cloth and made clothing, performed ritual tattooing and cared for children. Atayal societies were also strictly patriarchal. Centuries of rule by the rigidly gender-segregated Han Chinese and then the equally segregated Japanese obviously reinforced this. Even 3 centuries of occasional exposure to the less segregated European cultures brought by the Dutch, Portuguese, British and Americans has done little to change the situation. Consequently, work in Atayal communities is still largely segregated by gender. Although this segregation is less formal than in the past, it is still distinct and has an impact on community life in Smangus. Zhao and Shu write that in Smangus there is a gender imbalance in traditional ecological knowledge resulting from the traditional Atayal gender segregation of labour. They quote women in Smangus explaining why they are unable to supply information about plants, saying, quote, "I don't know, I didn't know it. I have seen it before. I don't know the function of these plants. You have to ask those men. This is because women are forbidden to go hunting with men." End quote. Zhao and Shu comment that women's traditional ecological knowledge was only partial and that, quote, "more often than not, the men reminded them of facts about hunting plants." End quote. Zhao and Shu also found that traditional gender segregation also resulted in a gender imbalance in responses to surveys by researchers, explaining, quote, "in most indigenous societies, the cultural norms grant men greater public access and recognition than women. Thus, any prominent individuals interviewed are often predominantly, if not exclusively, male." End quote. This raises the obvious question of what to do when traditional indigenous culture clashes with modern gender values. Internal challenges. Loss of traditional ecological knowledge. Zhao and Shu note that Smangus ecotourism has ironically come at the cost of traditional ecological knowledge in the younger generation for 2 reasons. Firstly, with the decline of traditional hunting and plant harvesting, fewer local plants are being gathered by hand, and traditional knowledge of them is not being transferred to the youth by the elders, as was originally practiced. Secondly, children who are educated outside the village lose access to this traditional knowledge. However, it should be noted that Zhao and Shu's article was published in 2011, and since then, Smangus has been attempting to solve this problem by incorporating traditional ecological knowledge into their own school curriculum. In 2018, Professor You Zhengyu of China Cultural University in Taiwan published a paper entitled "An Application of Sustainable Development in Indigenous Peoples Revival, the History of an Indigenous Tribe's Struggle in Taiwan," which I've cited previously in this video. Yu's paper indicates that in recent years, Smangus has been cooperating productively with scholars outside the community to, quote, "survey and record flora and fauna species in the mountainous regions," end quote. Consequently, it seems Smangus is both aware of this challenge and is taking effective steps to address it. External challenges. Conflict with other tribes. Yu notes that while indigenous tribal territorial boundaries were traditionally established by agreements between tribes, in the modern era, quote, "most of the land belongs to the state and various tiers of governments," end quote. As the indigenous tourism industry has grown, tribes have competed for territory, with their local business activities sometimes crossing traditional territorial boundaries. Since this land is legally owned by the government rather than the tribes themselves, indigenous people whose land is being encroached on by other indigenous people have no legal means of preventing such trespass. Yu quotes a tribal elder from Smangus describing this problem. The elder says, quote, "last month there was a group of tourists who intruded on our traditional territory, and they were guided by an indigenous tour guide living in another side of the mountain. You know, In the old days, such conduct was forbidden because it might have been seen as a provocative action and could result in a battle between two tribes. But nowadays, they claim that these lands belong to the state and everyone has the right to enter. By law, we had no right to disallow them to enter these lands, but by gaga, we had authority over the lands. End quote. So some tribes are taking advantage of the state's seizure of indigenous territory in order to profit from the land of neighboring tribes. With no legal recourse to prevent this, Smangus can only appeal to the traditional Atayal gaga and hope other tribes respect it. External challenges. Government interference. The previous example demonstrates Smangus' vulnerability to interference by other tribes, but of course that is the natural consequence of the fact that Smangus is not a sovereign community. Professor Yu quotes a government official making an unapologetically blunt statement about indigenous subjection to the state, saying, quote, "No matter what they claim, the reality is that indigenous peoples are under the sovereignty of this state, and, in consequence, they have to obey laws, regulations, and social norms to live the life they wish for." End quote. Rather condescendingly, he added, quote, "Offering opportunities for children to study in universities helps to mediate the misunderstandings between the mainstream society and their tribe, and we have seen some progress." End quote. Such an attitude certainly explains why Smangus has experienced regular government interference ever since establishing the Tnunan. It should be remembered that the reason why Smangus is experiencing this interference is not because they are an anarchist collective. It's simply because they are indigenous and are attempting to assert sovereignty over their own territory. One example of government interference is the Macau National Park controversy of 2005. On this occasion, 3 members of Smangus collected timber from a tree which had been toppled onto the road by a typhoon. In a display of absolutely stereotypical bureaucratic authoritarianism, the Forestry Bureau detained the men, formally charged them with theft, and they were found guilty in a court of law. Smangus took the matter to the Taiwan High Court, appealing to the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law of 2005, which allows Indigenous people to use resources located on their traditional territory. 4 years later, the High Court finally ruled in their favour. As foolish as this incident sounds, it resulted in a legal precedent for the defence of Indigenous practices and use rights. Another significant example of government interference, this one rather more amusing, took place in 2007. Smangus gave public notice of their intention to carry out a traditional Atayal territory claiming ceremony called Ba'usuruch Batunuch. A blog post by the Taiwan Indigenous Peoples Alliance described the ritual thus, quote, "Through this ceremony, Smangus declares its rejection to improper management of the state and its determination to manage its goyonam, traditional territory." End quote. Shortly after this announcement, 2 local police officers visited Smangus to advise that the ceremony may be in breach of the Assembly and Parade Act, and that the police station may deem it necessary to send officers to ensure public order was preserved. It is possible that the local government was concerned by the fact that the Ba'usuruch Batunuch is a ceremony symbolizing a tribe's sovereignty over its territory. The police were told the ceremony was very sacred and would be carried out without fail. The blog post reports this rather humorous exchange between Police Officer Fong and Atayal man Batu. Officer Fong says, quote, "If you insist that this activity be held, we will send many officers to express our concern should our supervisors so order." End quote. Batu responds in Atayal, quote, "Bahala mahamoha simulagah nano pekidata kalang mian sokhan." How come? If you really think this is the way it has to be, we'll see you tomorrow in the village. End quote. On this occasion, the police backed down. The day before the ceremony, the chief officer of the public order unit called Batu to inform him that after examination of relevant statutes, he had decided that, quote, "religious ceremonies and activities are not subject matters of the Assembly and Parade Law." End quote. He then told Batu that he was officially giving Smangus permission for the ceremony. In response, Batu courteously invited the officer to attend the ceremony. Alas, history does not record whether he was present on the following day. I will now show an interview with Smangus tribal leader Hui-wen. Here, Hui-wen explains the tremendous difficulty Smangus had in building and establishing their own elementary school. He describes the numerous ways in which government interference delayed and even jeopardized the school's construction. Before 2003, in our tribe, from elementary school age, that is, elementary school aged children, had to leave here to go to the Xingkong tribe's settlement for school. After completing junior high school, our children had to go to Zhudong to study. Therefore, for a long time, we hoped that our children could have the chance to receive education in our tribe, and our children from grade 1 to grade 6 could stay in our tribe so they could have a closer relationship with their parents. We could take care of them as well, and it took us so many years to achieve this goal. Finally, in 2003, a branch school was set up in our settlement, the Smangus Experimental Division of Xingkong Elementary School, or Smangus Elementary School. Although the government set up a branch school here, it was an experimental one only, because the government said maybe in just a few years there won't be enough students to run the school. So they decided to set up an experimental division here. Also, the government said students educated here wouldn't be competitive in comparison with children in the outside world. Our children would be less competitive and wouldn't be able to compete with students in the outside world. But what we wanted was really simple. We just hoped that in addition to ordinary national education, our children could learn about our culture and tradition, about Taiwan culture. That's what we really wanted to pass on to our children. However, the education unit in charge tried to close our branch in the very beginning. The unit told us that first, they couldn't provide us resources and funding. Next, there were not enough teachers in this division. In fact, being a student here is not easy. There are 6 classes, but we only have 4 teachers now. Our tribe was willing to make the offer. When the country couldn't provide us funding to build a school, we could do it ourselves. When our country had no land for us, we could offer a piece of land for our children's education, so they would have a healthy study environment. After we came to an agreement in a meeting, we started with the construction project. But soon after we started the project, the Agriculture Department of our county government sent us an official letter saying we violated the rules of the Soil and Water Conservation Act, saying we couldn't have a construction project in that land. Well, why was the place chosen? Why did we decide to build our school here? It was because of its geology, its terrain, and the safety made it the best location for a school. According to what the tribal people observed in the past 100 years, our ancestors told us this place was the best and safest in the area. So we decided to build our school there. For a period of time, we had some conflict with the Agriculture Department. For me, I don't really understand the government organization system. First, we had to communicate with the Education Department for the education issue. But why was the Agriculture Department finding us now? We told the Agriculture Department that the construction project was to build a school, but the department told us that was none of their business. They were only in charge of the land issue, so they kept fining us and stopping us from building a school. But we didn't give up. We had to build a school. Without a school, how would we provide our children with a place to study? The initial fine was 60,000 Taiwan dollars. That's 2,100 US dollars. Then it went up to 240,000 Taiwan dollars. That's 8,500 US dollars. My bank account was frozen. Luckily, there was no money in the account. If I'd had money in that account, I wouldn't have been able to take out the money. So if I had money in that account, the government would definitely have taken money from it. So I was lucky there was no money in that account. Sometimes it's good to be poor. If I'd had too much money in that account, they would have taken all my money. Why did we insist on building a school? We hoped to have a school here, so our children, especially those elementary school-aged children, those who really need their parents' love and support, could be with their parents and could have a very healthy, peaceful, and happy environment in which to study. That's what we asked for. A very simple thing. In this next interview, Smangus tribal leader Masai Solung describes how government interference in Smangus has grown ever since the main access road was built. He explains how the government surveils the village by air and occasionally sends inspectors to investigate their activities. Long ago, our ancestors were without transportation and electricity, but the tribe has survived until today, which shows that we are able to self-rule. However, since the road opened to traffic, the government started to interfere. They don't allow us to do this, and they don't allow us to do that. The hunting issue, for example, and reclaiming natural resources as well. Every 2 months, the government sends an airplane to fly over our tribe, to take photos, to see what we are doing here, or send people to investigate us. I really think our life shouldn't be like this. So our government really needs to understand our life, understand our culture first, before they step in to help. Then it will be better. Just like our tribe, we also want to give the best things to our next generation. Conclusion. The history of Smangus will not appeal to everyone. It is the story of anarchist realism rather than utopianism. Although Smangus is largely self-sufficient, it is not fully independent. Additionally, as an indigenous community within a colonizer state, Smangus does not enjoy sovereignty. Although it is largely independent, it is still compelled to appeal to state legislation and employ the state legal apparatus in order to secure its self-determination. The community is still subject to various forms of government interference which have hindered or delayed its development. Another issue is that Smangus is not scalable. It has no capacity to enlarge its geographical area, which in turn places practical limits on its population. Connected with this is the fact that Smangus is a mono-ethnic community, and according to the Galang Smangus Covenant, only other Atayal people are able to join. It's also facing those problems I described earlier. Nevertheless, Smangus is largely self-sufficient, it is sustainable, and it provides socio-economically and culturally for its members while protecting the ecology of its local environment. Smangus is an Indigenous Christian anarcho-collectivist community within a capitalist state which has adapted successfully to its material conditions without compromising its Indigenous, Christian, or anarchist identities. Now I will address Smangus and my Atayal friends in the Atayal language. Lalu makuga Yupas Rong. My name is Yupas Rong. Galang Smangus lokasimu valai. Vlak valai gagah tayen. Iwan valai nuksisai nanu lokasimu. Galang Smangus, I wish you all well. The Atayal traditions are very important. Despite all your difficulties, I wish you all well. This next message is to my two Atayal friends, Bawang Iban and Yayut Isal. Bawang Iban, Yayut Isal, lokasimu. Bazyak balai simu ini pekitala. Nano juk lungunga. Chalai shinmaramul laki tayen ulai balai. Pekita simu babalnya rauziki. Lokasimu valai, tayen lokah. Bawang Iban, Yayu Isal, I wish you well. I haven't seen you in a long time. Have you been busy recently? Oh, how much I miss the Atayal children of Chih-ching tribal settlement. I hope we can meet again soon. I wish you well. I wish the Atayal people well. And this is a final word to all my Atayal friends. Rangimaku taenquara, lokasimu valai. All my Atayal friends, I wish you very well. Lastly, a thank you to my patrons. The boots are on, Annie and Elias Atzvig.